Hello there. Today is Tuesday, December 29th. Welcome to Commissioner in a Car. I'm actually changing things up. I said earlier today that I was going to talk about 2021 in this edition of Commissioner in a Car. I'm going to save that for next week. And because I feel like I wanted to do a quick reflection on the year that was 2020. Because it was a year unlike no others. So I'm gonna off the cuff kind of run through the year and what I remember about it and all the different challenges that boards of elections have faced, as well as us here with this incredible horrible time that we're living through, and just kind of talk about it, because I think it's amazing what was accomplished this year despite all the ridiculous obstacles put in our way, both man-made and and also with this deadly virus that has ravaged our society and changed things and put elections on its end, as well as everything else in the world. So 2020 started off in January of 2020. I thought this was going to be a difficult year. A presidential year with a highest, everybody was looking forward to 2020 for 4 years, no matter what side of the aisle you were on. And going into January of 2020, with all the different changes that happened in 2019, such as early voting and universal transfer of registration and electronic poll books that changed elections, that was all done in 2019 in anticipation that 2020 would be the highest turnout election that on record, which it ended up being. And so in January of 2020, elections commissioners from across the state got together in our normal convention, and we talked about what the lessons we learned from 2019, how we can improve the early voting experience, and also using this in a primary, two primaries that were scheduled in 2020, and how we can meet the ever-burdening registration demands that would come to us in 2020. So we started off in January of 2020 kind of expecting that that we were going to expand upon the changes and work on getting funding for local boards of elections. As we rolled into February of 2020, it started to become kind of obvious that something weird was going on in the world. The virus was starting to peek its head up in China, but none of us really understood what this meant for us as boards of elections. And we were getting ready for the presidential primary. The Iowa caucuses had started, New Hampshire primaries. We were getting ready. It was looking once again like the April presidential primary that New York had scheduled was starting to become the focal point of the Democratic primary. Obviously, Donald Trump was already the Republican president. So in February of 2020, we were just starting to get ready for that. And at the end of February, we were starting petitions for statewide offices and state offices to get on the ballot. And by the end of February, I personally had gone to Albany a couple of different times. One time to lobby on behalf of election reforms and expanding early voting and other things. Another time to go on behalf of to support the it wasn't named that way right then, but it was the New York Voting Rights Act, which is now the John R. Lewis New York Voting Rights Act. And I had at the beginning of March, had a hearing on that, in-person hearing. How quaint, right? And we were talking about how this is needed and maybe would have been passed last session. I was in front of Senator Myrie, and it was a great hearing about protection of New York Voting Rights Act. And of course, all of us were looking forward to 2021 and some of the expansions that we could do for mail-in balloting that weren't quite possible yet in 2020, in March of 2020 anyways. So obviously as we got into March, the election world and our entire world was changed. The virus became what we know of it today, this deadly killer that was reshaping and changing our society, and we were going through a shutdown statewide by the middle of March. However, what was going on at that period was petitioning. That is how we get on the ballot here in New York, and so a decision had to be made, what to do about petitions, and how to end that process, because going door to door was no longer a viable option, but also continue to allow people to get on the ballot. So the governor, with the urging of elections commissioners throughout the state, ended the petition process early, said that you could get on the ballot if you had 30% of the petition threshold, and then gave them like 3 days to get that in or something like that. By the time it was mid-March when this order was given, and that is that was a huge change for us. And of course, boards of elections had to receive these petitions in person, had challenges to petitions, so we had to figure out how to do this while still shutting down our procedures, because at that point the Onondaga County Board and all the boards across the state were looking to send their people home and having work from home, which is the first time we've ever done that at the Onondaga County Board as well. So that was a major challenge for us, to figure out how we can safely, securely work at home, and also still properly serve the public in the middle of a very important electoral function. We worked with our IT department to come up with VPN networks for them to be able to log in and continue to process registrations and the other things that we needed to get done. By the end of March, it became clear that the April 28th presidential primary could not be held. It was, Super Tuesday had already happened. Joe Biden had already started to take a presumptive lead, and that June primary was, the April primary was now being seen as a formality, and since it was being, and other states were doing this as well, they were moving their primaries, and we also had special elections throughout the state. One right here in our local backyard in New York 50. The New York 50 was vacant, and Senator Antonacci had moved on to the Supreme Court, and John Mannion and Angie Renna were running in the special election to fill that, which was scheduled for April 28th. But because of this virus and because of the inability to really even pretend to hold in-person voting, and most of New York had voted in person all of our entire lives, it still does. We as election commissioners, both Democrat and Republicans, approached the governor's office and the legislative leaders and urged them to postpone the April presidential primary, if not cancel it. And they did. The governor responded. He did move the presidential primary to coincide with the June primary. There were March village elections that were postponed until September as well. So a lot of things happened near the end of March and early April to move elections. Then in April, we had to kind of pick up the pieces to that and figure out how we were going to hold the June primary. And in the beginning of April, we started to get the orders from the governor to come up with a ad hoc vote by mail system for the June primary, which would allow a ubiquitous use of absentee voting, which is not something that had ever been done in New York before. We were an excuse-based state, which meant about 3 to 10% of our electorate voted by mail. And in April, we were charged, the boards of elections were charged with finding a way to not only accept vote by mail from everybody who wanted to use it in June, but come up with a way to mail out to the voters what our our application, mailing out an application to every voter who wanted to get it, or every voter who was on the roll, both active and inactive. So anybody who wanted to be able to apply could apply. We also had to come up with an email and phone application system, something that we had never done before. So all of April was dedicated really to figuring out how we could start to take applications of vote by mail processes for the June primary. In May, we had to actually implement all of that. Vendors were chosen to help send out the applications, and we had a vendor here in Onondaga County that Duply came and presented to us, and they're kind of a local operation, and they were very good at helping us get this huge mailer out. And we had money that had come to us from the federal CARES grant that helped us run our primary, including this vote by mail. The vote by mail was also postage paid. The return of the envelopes and the return of the ballots were all postage paid for the June primary. That's not something that happened for the upcoming general. But it was seen that we were at the height of the virus when this decision was made, that it was seen as a burden, that if you wanted to vote by mail, it was seen that most people would vote by mail. That was a big part of May, was trying to get that in place and dealing with this huge surge of vote by mail applications. In fact, in Onondaga County, 60% of the people who ended up voting in the June primary ended up voting by mail. So that was a huge thing for us in Onondaga County to reimagine how to run an election. And of course, by the end of May and going into the beginning of June, we had to go into volunteer recruitment, well, not volunteers, but inspector recruitment for holding that June primary. Normally, we would have some classes that would have taken place before the June primary, but those classes were held in March and had to be stopped. Inspector classes were stopped, and we couldn't train our inspectors right before the primary, which is something that we try to do. At least some inspectors and poll site managers, we had to only have limited training for poll site managers that we could get in right before the June primary. And the poll site managers had to get trained on how to hold an in-person election and sanitize and properly run our polling places. And as you know, in New York, the presidential primary was moved from April to June, but in the special primaries were moved from April to June. But in mid-May, those primaries were canceled. But then a court case came about to reinstate at least the presidential primary, and that happened at the beginning of June. We finally got the court decision to reinstate the presidential primary, or it was in the middle of May or late June that all came about. So with a very short notice, that we had to get ballots back out to people that had already received ballots, allow them to mail those ballots back in, find a way to figure out how to replace presidential ballots as they came in, and tie them to the local elections. And then in late June, of course, we had to hold that presidential primary, which had higher turnout for a primary than we've ever seen, if you count both mail and in-person voting. And and we also were dealing with early voting for the first time in a primary. So we didn't know how that was going to be done. We had to figure out how to do that safely and with very limited resources, because we didn't have any new inspectors, because we couldn't train any new inspectors. And so we had to deal with the inspector base that we had, and many of them, rightfully so, just didn't want to work in the June environment. So in June, holding that June primary and getting enough inspectors, and I can tell you, in other parts of the state, it was just as dire. We were very lucky. In Onondaga County, I can tell you, we were holding that together by rubber bands and shoestrings, because it was we were having people calling out left and right the day of. We were understaffed at most polling places, but we had just enough polling inspectors to actually be able to deal with election day and get that done in a so the public did not notice how short-staffed we were. And it was a major feat, something that we spent all of June trying to get, begging, scraping people off the inactive roles to try to get them in and be inspectors, and replacing them at the last minute. We overstaffed, and we barely had enough by the time election day came to continue that. So then after the June primary was done, we had to figure out how to count all these absentee ballots that were done, because as I said, 60% of the public had to or voted by absentee in the June primary. And of course, as you know, we can't count those absentee ballots until after election day. So most July was dealing with the certification of that June 28th primary, and we had well over I think it was 13,000 absentee ballots for the June primary in Onondaga County. Compare that to normally getting about 500 absentee ballots for a primary. So we had to come up with a way to do that. There were several close races, but even the ones that weren't close didn't know what the ballots were going to do, because this was unlike a general election. When you have a primary, you have you just have members of one party, and you don't get assumptions that how these ballots are going to act based on their party enrollment. We don't know which candidates these people were choosing. We had no idea whether the absentee ballot universe would act remarkably different than the election day universe. And of course, we had this huge election day population that came out as well. In fact, even if we didn't have absentee ballots, election day would have been a massive turnout for a primary. So, and it turned out that the absentee ballots did behave differently than the election day ballots, but not enough to change any of the races that were on the ballot. And finally, when we got done at the end of July, we had to figure out how to run and train the massive amount of inspectors that we needed for the general election coming up, because that was the main thing that came out of the primary. Was we needed more inspectors. We needed newer, younger inspectors that would be willing to be in person. And so in August, our training session started. Normally we would have half of them trained early in the year and half of them trained later in the year. Now we had to do most of our training at the end of the year while also preparing for the general election. And one other thing that was changing the way we did elections is registration levels were dropping throughout the year. We weren't getting as many, although there was new registrants coming in, it wasn't as many as we normally would get in a presidential year, because there were no festivals, there were no on-campus events, there were no in-person registration events happening all year because of the rise of the COVID virus. So because of that, we started to see our registration numbers start coming in August and September. Massive amounts of registration forms coming in. So while we were trying to deal with training election inspectors in August and September, the massive amount of new registrations came in. In fact, Onondaga County went up to 308,000 registered voters. We ended last year at 288,000. So massive increase in registration voters. They all came in late. And we were very surprised at that, because not so surprised if you look at the numbers overall, but how they were coming in close to the deadline for registrations. So we were working on 12-hour days starting Labor Day, and didn't really even have days off in between them, because we were working on this registration project as well as the election inspector recruitment. We also were dealing with throughout the year of closing of polling places. We closed every polling place in a nursing home or senior housing facility. We made that decision at the Onondaga County Board before even the county health department had advised us to do so, although they did end up doing so, and so did the New York State Health Department. We had to, and we kept that rule for the general as well. So in September, we were also recruiting other polling places because we had several places that closed, a couple of churches that closed that never reopened because of COVID. So we had to move voters, there and get notices sent out. We had moved voters out of the nursing homes and senior living facilities, and then we had to notify all those voters for the general election that they were being moved to another polling place. So we did that, and of course, then in September, the absentee ballot took on a massive upgrade, which when New York State Board of Elections launched their portal. The portal option allowed people to apply online on the New York State Board of Elections for an absentee ballot. This resulted in over 60,000 absentee ballots, most of which that were requested through the portal in Onondaga County. 63,000 that were mailed out, 59,000 that were returned. This was another massive project that started in September and went all the way through in October, all the way until the end of October. Normally our last presidential election, 2016, had 16,000 absentee ballots. It grew to 59,000. So that was another burden that was placed on the boards of elections throughout New York State and in Onondaga County. And we worked together, found a way, and had we made the decision in Onondaga County not to use an outside vendor for mailing absentee ballots. We handled that all in-house. We brought in inspectors that were teamed in bipartisan matters to get that mailing out, printed our own labels, printed our own envelopes. And the reason we did that is that we saw some problems with vendors mailing out absentee ballots down in New York City and other places during the primary, and we decided that we're responsible for this. This is something, and we could do it more cost effectively as well, but also we would have the ability to control how this happened. So that was a massive change that we were making on the fly to do this, and it paid off because people did get their ballots, and we were able to track, and get those ballots back in a reasonable manner. We also then came up with a system for people to drop off absentee ballots, because in mid-September we had the massive, I keep using massive because that's what this year was, but the unfortunate delays at the U.S. postal system and the changes there that made the public uncomfortable with dropping off their ballots in the mail. So we had to come up with a solution that people could drop off their absentee ballots at early voting and in-person voting centers. We came up with Billy the Ballot Bag. You may remember him, the little blue bags that were at every polling place. And that worked out great. We had them at early voting, and we had them at polling places, and they collected a good amount of absentee ballots came in those bags and were turned in during the early voting and election day period. But then, speaking of early voting, what an amazing thing that we had to deal with there, because of the unsurety of the post office, and because people wanted to have the convenience of voting when they wanted to, and many, over a quarter of the people who turned out decided to vote early in the 9 days leading up into the election. This put a huge burden on our meager early voting sites. As you know, I've been an advocate for expanding early voting, and I could not get agreement from the county legislature to provide resources for it, or the Republicans in Onondaga County were always dead set against doing anything more than the bare minimum, and that's what we did. The bare minimum of 6 early voting sites. I will say one thing though. on that first weekend of early voting, when lines were out the door and parking was ridiculous at a lot of these early voting sites, I did manage to convince, and in her defense, she was absolutely on board with doing it. The Republican commissioner of Onondaga County, we expanded hours, and we were the first in the state to expand hours for early voting to deal with this huge influx of voters. And we announced it on the Monday of early voting that on the Saturday and Sunday we would have 2 extra hours a day. In those 4 hours, we processed over 2,000 more voters in those 4 hours. So it was the right thing to do. I'm glad we did it. And I'm glad Commissioner Sardo agreed with me on it and advocated for it as well, because it was the right thing to do to try to lessen those lines. And we saw on the second weekend of early voting, while the lines were still pretty long, we were having less than 30-minute waits as opposed to other days, which was 40 minutes to an hour waits over every site. That does underscore the need of what we have to really manage in early voting going forward. We cannot have just the bare minimum sites, so we're going to see a repeat of 2020 as well. But 59,000 people did early voting, and again, not knowing how many people would come out, and last year having only 8,000 out in a non-virus environment, and with expanded absentees, we could not have anticipated how many people were going to come out and early vote in October. So a lot of that had to be done on the fly. We had to surge more inspectors to these polling places. We had to surge resources. We had to do little things like the lines were so long in some of these places. We were walking the lines with our absentee ballot bags, taking absentee ballots, and then seeing people that may be seniors or in walkers and bringing them to the front of the line. That was something that we didn't really anticipate before this time, and I think it's something that we're going to have as part of our early voting procedures when there are lines, to walk the lines and bring people in. And then, of course, November came, and the biggest presidential election that we had to deal with on November 3rd, we did. We overstaffed our polling places. We still saw a tremendous amount of people come out in person. Well over 120,000 people, I believe. It was somewhere in that neighborhood. Came out and voted in person on November 3rd in Onondaga County. That was about 50% of the populace voted in person. 25% voted absentee and 25% voted early. So we still had a massive amount of voters come in. And tomorrow, I'll talk a little bit more about early voting in my Wonky Wednesday tomorrow. But we had all these voters come in. We had to get them through, and for the most part, it worked. We had a couple of polling places that had some technical issues that were fixed. Some of them that had some issues with the people running them that weren't used to the new technology. We put on-demand polling printers for the first time on election day in the field, on election day and on primary day. That's a big change that we're hoping to continue to expand next year, because they worked very well in most of the places. Places we had some technical issues, most of the time were human error, and then once that was fixed by the beginning of the morning, things were moving along pretty smoothly after that. And then finally, we saw a lot of after election night was done, and we were then had to figure out how to do the absentee balloting, and we had a plan in place. We were going to be one of the first counties in New York to be done. We had an aggressive counting plan, and then the lawyers came in. And the lawyers from the state GOP sued our board to slow down our counting process, which was a direct violation of the governor's executive order, so they could harbor and levy challenges like we've never seen before to absentee ballots, to try to protect the leads of the Republicans on election day. And we had to deal with that in court. There was a small delay in the start of absentee ballot counting to allow for these ridiculous requests that were shown to be ridiculous as they made them. They kept making more and more requests, more and more demands for more and more documents just to delay the absentee ballot counting. But then we started our absentee ballot counting, and we were going along at an incredible pace. By the Friday, the first week of absentee ballot counting, we were getting ready to be done within a week of, within 10 days to 12 days of election day, we were going to be finished. But then COVID reared its ugly head, and our board suffered a COVID outbreak where 13 of our 26 workers tested positive for COVID. When we found out we had one employee that was positive, we stopped the absentee ballot counting immediately. We got everybody tested. It turned out there were 13 people that were asymptomatic and positive, and that shut down our board for 2 weeks. We could not count absentee ballots during that 2-week period. Many of the people that were counting the candidates and watchers had to quarantine as well. In fact, everyone did. And we were on a 14-day quarantine. And it ended up delaying our absentee ballot counts by 17 days before we could restart the ballot. And those 17 days were frantic and hard because we were worried about the health of our employees. That was number one. Many of them had some really severe issues with COVID. COVID is not a joke. And so we worked with the county health department to make sure that everybody was tested, that everybody was able to recover, and then come up with some steps to be able to recount or to resume the count in a safer environment. I must say that the absentee ballot counting, though the outbreak happened during that point, it was happening amongst the staff at an earlier point before we started the absentee ballot counting. We just weren't aware of it because of the asymptomatic spread. Nobody in the absentee ballot room, thank God, contracted the virus through that absentee ballot process. But that 17 days we had to hold, we had to finish, getting everybody healthy and recover, and then we came back, and it was scary coming back. But we were able to finish the absentee ballot count. We ended up counting about 10,000 ballots a day. That is an amazing number of ballots that we ended up counting to close it out. And that's kind of where we wanted to be before the objections came in. And we still had to deal with all these objections that were levied, but they were finally lifted after the outcome was no longer in doubt for many of these candidates. And so we ended November finally with results, and things were counted. We were finishing up the certification, and then December happened, and while we were looking forward to a quiet December so we could get ready for the 2021 campaign, the issue of the county legislature deciding to cut our budget and cut our salaries came up. And this made a lot of press, some press statewide. It was out of the blue. It was unexpected. It was incredibly partisan, and it was something that let alone my salary, but the cutting of the budget itself. After dealing with all of the stuff that we had to deal with this last year, it was such a slap in the face. And but the public is what I will take out of that, because the public rallied without really even being asked to. All of a sudden there were calls going into the legislators. There was action being talked about in Albany. There was letters to the editors. There was amazing editorials, and there was finally some pushback to some of the things that have been happening at the Board of Elections with county legislators throughout the state have done stuff like this where they tend not to support the Board of Elections in the way they need to be. So that was a tough time. It was tough to live through that at the end of a very tough year, but the end result was okay. The county executive made a veto decision, but to veto the cuts in a way, it was kind of a technical way of doing it, but still at the end of this, our budgets were still cut. The county health department's budgets were still cut. The county comptroller's budgets were still cut. And our salaries, while did not get cut, they did still take action to make sure that we can never get a raise ever again without them approving it. We're the only two management confidential employees in the entire county that have to live under that Damocles sword. I don't know what their motivation for that is, but I can tell you that it's not going to change the way I do my job any day, ever. So I'm going to go into 2021 knowing that we lived through 2020 with all these obstacles. I'm so proud of the Board of Elections employees and what they did to make everything happen. And I know that we can face further challenges that will come up in 2021. COVID is not going away. We're going to have expanded use of absentees and hopefully early voting. There's going to be lots of election law changes coming our way. And we're going to have massive amounts of local offices up for running. And we still have to figure out how we're going to get them on the ballot. We'll talk about that in next week's episode. But I just wanted to reflect on what a crazy and ridiculous year 2020 has been for elections in New York and here in Onondaga County. And I hope that all of you are staying safe. I hope you're wearing a mask when you go out. I hope you're not going out, and I hope you will take this very seriously, so we can all get through this dark winter, and hopefully help will be on the way with the vaccine coming to all of us by March or April, and then hopefully we can figure out how to put the 2021 elections together. So stay tuned. Thank you very much for tuning in and watching this each and every week or whenever you can, and stay safe, and I'm looking forward to seeing you again in 2021. Bye-bye. Oh, and I guess I should say that I got a couple of interesting Zoom with Zarnies coming up. Perry Grossman of the NYCLU, his episode will air on December 31st. And we'll be talking a lot about election law changes, but also the work he's doing nationally to help with the census and the lawsuits about reapportionment, and also the John R. Lewis Voting Rights Act. We have a lot to talk about with that. And I will also be interviewing for the first time Colette Matthews Carter, who's the new president of the Syracuse NAACP. Her interview will air on Sunday, January 4th, and I hope you enjoy that. I did have to move my interview with Liza Abraham of the New York Democratic Lawyers Council because she's so busy dealing with the Georgia elections, which is good work. So she's got to go out there and help them out, and she's working on helping them out. So we're going to get her back in after those elections are done and talk about with the work they did and the work that they're going to do in 2021. So now I'm going to say goodbye. Have a good new year. Stay safe, stay home, and act responsibly. Bye-bye.